As Mary said, my name is Matt. I'll be your Seth Rogen impersonator for the weekend. And so I grew up in the evangelical world, and then over the course of my life came to be identified as a Presbyterian, and now I am a Protestant scholar who works on Islam and studied at a Catholic university. So got a little bit of a distinct journey. So I'd like to think tonight about this image of a tree and about how Christianity is a little bit like a tree. I think that's enough for the night, right? Are we done? Are we done? We're good? I'll add a little more. So I think the experience of growing up in the church, you're aware that there are other Christians out there, there are other forms of Christianity out there, and you are here. You find yourself somewhere. You find yourself at a Presbyterian church. You find yourself in the Washington, D.C. area or in Baltimore where I live. And you're here. And you grow up in that space. And that's what's familiar to you. And sometimes people around you throw around fancy terms like Reformed or Presbyterian. And because you grew up with it, that sounds kind of natural until someone asks you to explain it. Then you're like, you know, Presbyterian? And if they don't know, then it's kind of hard to tell them what that means. And what about everyone else? What about the people who are Christians who are not Presbyterians? What about the people who may worship the way that we just experienced? Where do they fit in the tree? So what I'd like to do in the next 20 minutes or so is run through about 2,000 years of history, just to get to the present and why you are here. And it has something to do with Santa Claus punching someone. And it has something to do with arguments over bread. And we're going to figure out why you're here. Okay? Sound all right? So we have to start in the early Christian church. This is the church of the 1st to the 3rd century. So about the first 300 years of the early church. So Jesus and all of his early followers were Jewish. Did you know that? Jesus and all of his early followers were Jewish. They were not Christian. Jesus was not a Christian. Jesus was born a Jew. He was circumcised a Jew. He lived as a Jew. And he died as a Jew. And so the early church starts asking, as they are trying to figure out who they are and what this means after the death and the resurrection of Jesus, is Jesus the Jewish Messiah? This is a term that other Jews at the time are talking about. This idea of someone who's anointed, the new king, the descendant of David, the one who's going to restore the kingdom of God. And this is the term in Greek is Christ. Okay? Messiah, Hebrew, Christ, Greek. And everyone in the early church agrees, Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. So, does that mean that anyone who wants to follow Jesus needs to become a Jew? If you've ever read the New Testament, this is the debate that is going on in the New Testament. You might not have ever noticed it, but this is the argument that everyone is fighting over in the New Testament. This is what Paul is fighting about. This is what James is fighting about. This is what the book of Revelation is fighting about. Does everyone who follows Jesus need to become a Jew? Do they need to follow Torah? Do they need to follow the law? Do they need to observe the Jewish ritual practices? And ultimately, the church concludes, the early Christians conclude, no. Not everyone who follows Jesus needs to be a Jew. And so Paul uses this image in the book of Romans, in chapter 11, that we, Gentiles, that's just a word for anyone who's not Jewish, we who are Gentiles are grafted in. So the idea is, if you have an olive tree, or any kind of tree really, you can cut off a branch, and you can actually stick a branch from another tree on there, and hopefully it'll start growing. And this is the image that Paul uses for all of us who are not Jewish. We get grafted in to the covenant, grafted in to the work of God that God was doing amongst the Jews and continues to do amongst the Jews. We, as the Gentiles, we're the wild branches that got stuck to this cultivated olive tree. So Paul is using this image of trees and of us being kind of inserted in, brought into the work that God was already doing for the Jewish people through Jesus. So this is the world of the early church. This is more or less what you were experiencing when you went through those catacombs, through those dark caves. That was the experience of some of these Christians living in Rome, living in these different cities around the Mediterranean. They had a complicated relationship with Judaism and Jewishness. They were sometimes persecuted by the Romans. They had very little power. They went and sometimes worshipped in the graveyard, in the catacombs. And whether that experience seemed awesome to you or seemed really weird, those are your spiritual ancestors. So that was the world of the early church. And we start with this foundation of Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, and pretty soon some other big questions start to come up. So the New Testament sometimes refers to Jesus as the Son of God. What does that mean? Try starting from afresh. Try not having thought about that question before. What does that mean, to be the Son of God? Is Jesus God? Or is Jesus a created being that comes from God? And the question lurking behind this that we can see in retrospect is, what is the Trinity? When we talk about the Trinity, what is that? And so there's this monk named Arius. And Arius, he's very good at writing jingles. He writes little tunes. And one of the tunes that he writes is, the Son of God is created. It works better in Greek. The Son of God is created. And what he means by that is he's like, we're having this big debate about what does it mean that Jesus is the Son of God? I figured it out. I have a son. Monks could have sons in those days. That was allowed. I have a son. That son came after me and was created through me. So that's what it means that God has a son. Jesus, the Son of God, was created after. The other little jingle that he wrote was, there was a time when he was not. Again, works better in the Greek. But there was a time when he was not. God existed before Jesus. The Son of God comes after. And so this is where we get to Santa Claus. So there's another one of these figures in the early church named St. Nicholas. And there's a whole group of people that gather at a place called Nicaea, which is just south of Constantinople, south of modern-day Istanbul. And they get together and they're all arguing about Arius' little jingles. Is he right? Is this okay? And they ultimately say no. They ultimately say, no, Arius is wrong. And in fact, things get so heated at the Council of Nicaea that at one point St. Nicholas, who's on the other side of this debate, walks over and slaps Arius. That's right. Santa Claus got so pissed off at Arius that he punched him. Might be a legend, but it's what the early church remembers. So this council, this group of church leaders get together under the Emperor Constantine, who was recently converted, and suddenly you have this merging of empire and Christianity, as Quinn was pointing out, these Roman pieces that are entering into the life of the church. And they put together something that's called the Nicene Creed. Has anyone ever heard of the Nicene Creed? You've probably said it in church. You've probably read it. The part you didn't read in church is actually the kind of fun part. At the end of the Nicene Creed, you're actually saying the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, but let's not quibble over the details. The end of the Nicene Creed is, and we say that anyone who says the Son of God was created is condemned. And we say anyone who says there was a time when he was not is condemned by the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. So screw you, Arius. That's what the Nicene Creed is. It's saying, here's what is correct Christianity, and Arius, you're wrong. Okay, and so the church continues to grow out of this, but Arius and his ideas get pushed out. They say, that is not, here's another technical term for you, that's not orthodox. That's not right belief. It's not right practice. You are incorrect. Your words are not adequate for our understanding of how the church is supposed to go. Now, I happen to think that they did the right thing at the Council of Nicaea. I think Arius was wrong. But you have to recognize, suddenly we have this dividing point where there's a right Christianity, an official Christianity, with the Roman emperor presiding, and some versions that are officially rejected. Not to mention fistfights involving Santa Claus. So that it sets the tone for so much Christian history, is this Council of Nicaea, this group of Christian leaders who decide Arius is wrong. So now we have the trunk of the tree formed by the council's decision, and everyone's saying the Nicene Creed, and they add a few more creeds. If you really want to get into the other creeds, I'm happy to do that. I'm a total nerd on this stuff, but we'll stick with that. There's some arguments about Jesus and Mary, but things get along pretty much hunky-dory up until the 11th century. No more fist fights, well, a few more fist fights, but not as many fist fights. Santa doesn't punch anyone else. And suddenly you come to the 11th century and a new debate comes up. This one's about authority. Who is the head of the church? And there's one person who's in Rome on the Italian peninsula there, who is the Bishop of Rome. Some people call him the Pope. And there's another person who's claiming to be the authority, the Patriarch of Constantinople, over on the other side of the Mediterranean. And these people over here are speaking Latin, and these people over here are speaking Greek. And they're arguing about, well, what is the real church? Where did Jesus give the authority to? And the Patriarch of Constantinople says, well, I was the one that Jesus and the apostles gave the authority to. And the Pope says, well, I was the one that Jesus and the apostles gave the authority to. And guess what their solution was? Guess. Huh? Split the church. So the Pope says, all those people over there, not real Christians, or at least not right Christians. And the Patriarch of Constantinople says, all those people over there, not right Christians. And so you have the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. This is where these terms start to come from. This is happening in the 11th century, in 1054. So now we have two major branches of the church. They're both still saying the Nicene Creed, and they have this disagreement about authority. But where does authority come from, and who gets to hold it? Who gets to wield it? They're not really able to talk to each other for a very long time. So we come then to the 16th century with these two main branches of Christianity. And the Roman Catholic Church develops throughout this period and grows and morphs and still has some of those trappings of imperial power. And this is where that Mass that we experience, that service that we just experienced, comes from. Is the late medieval Roman Catholic Church, speaking Latin, with some of the trappings of Rome, some of the pageantry of all of these years of development, some of this theology about the bread and the wine and who gets to touch that, who gets to be around that, and this mysterious and elaborate and beautiful, and most people would also agree corrupt. And so Luther comes along, but I would just note, those people are also our spiritual ancestors. Those people who are speaking Latin and doing things that might seem foreign to us, they're also our spiritual ancestors. So Martin Luther comes along in 1517 and says, I have some questions about this. Luther is a priest. Luther is a monk. Luther is a Bible scholar, raised within this Roman Catholic world. And he actually loves a lot of the beauty of it. But he has questions about it and wants to challenge some parts of it. Now, there's a lot of things you could say about the Protestant Reformation. You could focus in on what different types of worship we do now. You could focus in on the different practices that we have. But I think the thing that it really comes down to is, again, this question of authority. Who gets to read and interpret the Bible? Where does that authority come from? That is the big thing that the Protestants and the Catholics are arguing about. And the Roman Catholic side is the church and the Pope, and the tradition gets to interpret the Bible. And the Protestants are arguing, well, no, the Bible should interpret itself, and we all get to participate in that process. But the problem is the Protestants can't all agree on what the Bible says. And so there isn't one Protestant Reformation, there's actually 3 or 4. So one group of Protestants, they call themselves the Anglicans, the Church of England, following Henry VIII, the King of England, he's not the kind of historical character you want to model your life off of, I'll just put it that way. And Henry VIII decides that he's just going to replace the Pope. He'll be the new Pope. He'll keep practices more or less what they were before, and we'll just get rid of the Pope, and the King will be the new Pope. So that's another model. That works for Henry VIII, at least. You start having these other debates among some of the other groups of Protestants. At one point, the Lutherans, who are the followers of Luther, by the way, and the Reformed, who are another group of these Protestants, some of our ancestors, start having some argument about bread. Right? If you noticed in the service there, the bread and the wine are very, very important. And this is true for a lot of the Protestants as well, the early Protestants. Is what is going on when we take communion? And this is so important that they're willing to fight over it. And at one point they get together, and all these different Protestants get together, some of the Reformed people and some of the Lutheran people. They're like, let's work it all out. Let's have a colloquy. Let's have a gathering, and we'll work out our differences. And they've got a list of 14. They get through the first 13. We're on the same page. And they get to the Lord's Supper, and they start having an argument. The argument is, what is actually going on when you eat that bread and drink that wine? And Luther is sitting there arguing, well, the Catholics kind of got it right. They're too extreme, but Jesus is really there. And some of the Anabaptist type folks, and we'll talk about them in a second, start saying, not really, it's just a symbol. It's just a symbol. And some of the Reformed people come in, like Calvin, John Calvin, they're like, I think Jesus is under the bread. Everyone's like, what do you mean? It's under the bread. And Luther and the Anabaptists, that's dumb, that's stupid. And finally Luther gets out a piece of chalk and writes on the table, this is my body, what Jesus said, and storms out. And the Protestants could never get together again after that. You have these different divisions. There's this other group that I just mentioned, some of the Anabaptists. Ana just means, again, Baptists. These are the people who said, you know what? You shouldn't be baptizing infants. They aren't making a decision. You need to wait till people are adults. I was baptized when I was 11 years old, when I made a decision. And there are a lot of Christians that view it this way. I'm guessing most of you were probably baptized as children, as little babies. And the Anabaptists are coming along and offering this radical new way. And Luther and the Reformed people, they hate the Anabaptists. They think they're crazy. They're like the Bernie Sanders of the 16th century. And so they reject that. That is not Christianity. So these are the different strands. These are different elements of Protestantism. And when we come into as these things develop, as they grow out, you start having different names that these folks start calling themselves, different denominations that they start affiliating themselves with. So there's Episcopalians and Quakers and Methodists and Congregationalists. Oh, hey, there's us, Presbyterians, and Baptists and Amish and Pentecostals, etc., etc., etc. We Protestants love renaming ourselves. What's my point? There are many ways to be Christian. All of these people, they're all saying the Nicene Creed. They're all believing 90 to 95% of the same stuff. There are many different ways to be Christian. They're all connected back to the Jewish roots of Jesus. But they're all expressing Christian faith in these different, diverse ways. They have different languages. They have different vocabularies. They have different rituals. They have different arguments with each other. There are many ways to be Christian. Each of us is born into a family with generations, with history, and a backstory. We spend most of our lives, at least most of our young lives, our young adult lives, learning those stories. Are you ever annoyed when your parents tell you the same story again and again and again? Or your grandparents sit down and want to make sure that you've heard this one story. We hear these stories about our eccentric cousins that we never met. They're kind of odd, and everyone keeps talking about them. And you have these family legends that we carry around. Maybe they actually happened, maybe they didn't. Maybe Santa Claus really did punch Arius, maybe not. There's these old grudges and fights that we somehow inherited, and nobody really remembers what Aunt Kathy and Aunt Lindsay are fighting about, but they don't put them in the same room. We have rituals and habits that we practice that keep changing over time, but still somehow stay the same. Christianity's like that. Christian faith is like that. It's like a tree. And you are here in the Reformed Presbyterian branch of Protestantism, which came out of the Roman Catholic Western branch of the church that still says the Creed of the Council of Nicaea. That's why you are here. Whether you chose that history or inherited it, whether you are proud of all of your family history or not, whether you agree with every decision your spiritual ancestors made or not, whether you will stay here for the rest of your life or not. So what we're doing this weekend, what we do in confirmation, is we come back and think about, what does it mean to do this as an adult? I didn't go through confirmation. As I told you, I made a decision when I was a young adult or young teenager that I was going to affirm my Christian faith and go and get baptized. So you all are going on a journey that I've never had. And so I'm not totally sure what to tell you about that journey. But I'll give you a few ideas. We'll throw a few things out. We'll ask some questions and talk together this weekend. And feel free to hit me with any question you got. Okay? I don't know you. I'm sort of safe. I'm weird. I know some stuff about history and these different groups. Hit me with whatever you got. I'll try to answer it. And we'll think together about what it means to be Reformed. Because this is something that I actually did choose as an adult, to become a Presbyterian. Confirmation is a personal and voluntary identification with this Reformed family. This Reformed branch of all of this craziness that is Christianity. With all of its beauty and all of its warts. And I'm happy to talk about both the beauty and the warts this weekend. So, where are we going? Tomorrow, we're going to spend the morning thinking about what does it mean to live by grace in the Reformed tradition. What do we mean when we talk about Reformed theology? That's a loaded phrase. What difference does being Reformed make in our lives? And then tomorrow afternoon, we'll think about how do you be a lifelong Christian? What does it mean at confirmation you're confirming a commitment to be part of the or a church? How do we sustain that for the rest of our lives? What are some handholds that we can have to hang on to that for the rest of our lives? I did it in 23 minutes.